Jens Larsen is Chief European Economist at RBC Capital Markets and joins us now from the bank's London office. Jens, thank you so much for joining us on the show. In terms of what we've seen, yet another meeting where a lot of the politicians say, well, we need to do something together. We're ready to act, but actually we don't know what they're doing. We don't know whether they're increasing, and there's no clear message of actually how much political will there is behind this general comment about sticking together. Were you disappointed?
It's difficult not to be disappointed with these meetings. There's always a sense that more could have been achieved. But I do think George Osborne's point about a specific timetable leading up to the G20 meeting is really important. That gives a sense that I think EU leaders have understood the dire straits they're in, and that action is required. And I think that's the idea that there is a timetable, that there is a plan, and that it is being worked on is really important. Now we hear these plans about boosting the capacity of the EFSF, finding ways to restructure Greece's debt and to recapitalize the European banking system. I think these are the three necessary elements in a package. If they put something together along those lines, that would be a big step forward. Yep. But as you say, whether they're going to do it or not is always the open question.
But Jens, we talk about the political will and the fact that now our politicians seem to finally realize the urgency of the situation. But it seems that even if they themselves realize the urgency of the situation, they have people at home that are voting against them. We saw that very clearly with Angela Merkel. So how easy is it, once a politician realizes that they need to come with a solution, that they actually write it down on paper without being backstopped by the very people that vote for them?
I think there's a bigger issue, which is the democratic deficit in this process, which is basically governments are signing off on complete changes to the European Union without explicit electoral support. But I think in nearer term, the tactical political situation is not as bad as it seems. I think part of this discussion of boosting the EFSF with supporting ECB purchases is exactly about circumventing that. I don't like circumventing. I don't think it's as straight as it should be. But I think in the near term, it might be a way to make this political process work.
So the one thing that they need to do sooner rather than later, their number one priority, as it were, would be to increase the EFSF to something like 1 trillion. Would that be enough to ring-fence Greece and any other countries applying for some kind of coordinated default whilst remaining in the Eurozone?
I'm worried about this guessing game about how big it should be. I think the key thing here is really the interplay between the EFSF and the ECB balance sheet. The ECB has got a balance sheet that's very big. We all know it's very big, and if that can come into play in an effective way, much more effectively than it is currently, then I think that could change the game. But clearly, the ECB can't take all that credit risk. Governments need to step in there, and that is where the EFSF could play an important role. So that's what I think we need to look for.
But is there a risk? We were hearing from one of the other news agencies talking about what the S&P has said, that if we increase the EFSF by too much and it's governments taking on the burden, then they're also at risk at losing their AAA credit rating here in Europe.
There's certainly a risk of that, and I think this is where I think it's slightly hocus pocus. If you get the ECB to buy up the debt, then somehow it doesn't affect the debt levels of the various governments. Whereas if you get the EFSF to buy up the debt, it does. It's the same thing in the end. The ECB belongs to the governments, and it is their responsibility. So whether it's one way or the other, it doesn't really matter. If you purchased all this debt, the risk is the same. And I think the smoke screen around where the risk sit is not particularly helpful. But I think again, in terms of immediate action, getting the ECB balance sheet in there would be important.
But this is a role, of course, that the ECB has said in the past it doesn't really want to do. We're also seeing a change at the head of the ECB. How much more difficult is it going to be for Mario Draghi to come in and put extra stimulus or whatever is needed to prop up the crisis?
I think a guarantee from the government, even if it comes via the EFSF, will make a big difference to the ECB. I think the ECB is not so worried about doing the operations. I think the ECB is worried about the conflation of fiscal and monetary policy. If you take the loss-making element out of it for the ECB, it should be a lot easier for them to carry on conducting their purchases.
Jens, talk me through the timeline. I mean, we're talking about it, certainly what the Chancellor wants, the UK Chancellor, is some kind of goal towards that November G20 meeting. But then in December, we also have a couple of the European countries voting on the EFSF. When are we going to have a clear situation, whether it's going to go through or whether we're in a danger zone and disaster zone? Will it be before the end of the year?
I think complete clarity on this situation is not going to come for a long while. But I hope with this kind of process, if you build that kind of momentum, I think we could have a little bit more confidence that we'll avoid the most extreme outcomes. You asked me, the first question you ask is, is there enough for Greece to avoid a Greek default? And I think if you're setting down a clear direction where European leaders seem to be moving towards this stronger fiscal union, a stronger capacity for the EFSF, then I think we can start discounting some of those really bad outcomes that are currently worrying markets.
But when will we start discounting those? Again, is it going to take 9 months, 6 months? Or is it just too difficult to predict?
I think that's very hard to predict. If you had asked me back in March, I thought that meeting was going to be great. And frankly, many people in the markets in January of this year thought that if we got to the March meeting, then everything would be hunky-dory. Now, it isn't hunky-dory, and I think I'm not going to be saying to you that with a G20 meeting, everything will be sorted. But I think it is important, and I think it is an outcome of this IMFC meeting, that European leaders seem to have finally caught on to that there's a very high degree of urgency to getting their acts together.